Hey everybody, Nick here, and today I got a review for you of this little guy. This is the Kizer Knives Fireant. And by the way, that's ant as in A-N-T rather than A-U-N-T. If you've got a fire ant, then I guess that actually makes you Aries, because then I guess Hestia would be your aunt. Either way, she'd be fine. I digress. This is the Kizer Knives Fireant. And actually, before I go any further, without diving deep into Greek mythology, we should give you something that is a fact, which is that this was provided to me directly by Kizer. Kizer reached out to me, said, "Hey, Nick, we got a couple of new models," and I was interested in the design of this little guy, so I said, "Sure, hey, Kizer, I'll take a look at that guy." But as always, I told him I'm going to talk about the good, the great, the bad, and the ugly. It might be a gem, it might be junk, and they did still send it along. But nevertheless, we have to assume this is the very best quality controlled one of these guys ever, although I kind of doubt it, and I'm doing my best not to let that fact affect my review. Next thing, Hestia, really? Did I go? Anyways. Let's do a size comparison. This is the Spyderco Delica. This is the Ontario Rat number 2. And so what we can see here is that size-wise, this thing's actually pretty small, both in terms of its overall blade length, which is, in terms of sharpened length, about equivalent to the Delica, but actually in its handle size as well. That is one thing I like about this very much, is it is a compact little knife. It folds itself down nicely, and then here it is against the Spyderco PM2, which is another really nice choice for size comparison, because I use it all the time. Anyway, so there is the Spyderco PM2 there. And then one thing I'll do here as well is I'll go ahead and I'll do a quick measurement of the length of this guy. This guy is going to come in here in terms of blade length around 2.75 inches. So it should be uncontroversially legal in a number of places, if not, well, certainly not every place, but yeah, that's definitely a thing. Then finally, a quick note, this is a Dirk Pinkerton design. See right there, there's his make and mark. He's done a bunch of stuff I've done on the channel before. I believe he did some of the, he did some stuff with Kizer's budget brand, 10 gram. He had the Rogue, I believe, was one of his. Either way, he's a designer I've featured before, and I actually talked with him a little bit in the run-up to this review, and so it seems like a nice guy. So there we go. Let's go on ahead and jump into the good, the great, the bad, the ugly of this interesting little knife right here. So on the good side, honestly, I like big parts of this design very much. That's going to be a repeating theme here. The design of the knife is good. It is a nice little size. Like I said, it is relatively compact. This guy in the pocket is actually smaller than the Spyderco Delica by a pretty good margin, although the blade length it's packing is very similar, and so that's nice. Next thing, it's relatively lightweight as well. Pull out my scale right here, and what we can see is that this guy comes in at 2.71 ounces, so it's a little bit under an ounce an inch. Just a very little, but it is a little bit under an ounce an inch, and that's good. Next thing, this guy has a very snappy deploy. That's because the detent on this is very, very hard. It is absolutely 100% strongly, snappily deploying. And that means that it is relatively reliable. If anything, the unreliability in this action is slipping off of the thumb stud because the detent is too hard. But when it does deploy, it is very, very snappy. There is no element of, oh, let's slowly guide it out here. No, it's just really super snappy. So there you go. Next thing, this guy has a very heavily scalloped little frame lock area here. What I mean by that is it's very easy to get your finger in there and disengage the lock bar. We'll talk about that little area later on, but with that, it is a nice little touch, and that's one way to make it such that there is no carve out on this side, which can actually be ergonomically helpful because both of the liners, well, I'm sorry, both sides of the frame, that is, are in exactly the same place, and that's good. Next thing, ergonomically speaking, it's pretty good. It's not perfection. There's a little bit of hot spotting off the clip, and, you know, some of this jimping is not strictly speaking necessary, but overall it is actually pretty good in the hand. And even though it is a relatively small knife, in my relatively small hands, it fits well. It goes in there nicely. Next thing, this does have a lock bar insert with over travel stop, which is a beautiful thing always. And then finally, I do kind of like the finish on the scales here. Although it definitely shows wear. You can already see a little bits of wear here and there. It is attractive, and frankly, it's a little nicer than the bead blast finishes that Kizer has done historically, where they just kind of pummel the steel with some medium or another until it becomes sort of a dull gray. I like a little bit of the reflectivity, although you do pay the price in terms of marking. So to me, at least, that's what's good here. Is a nice scale finish, a lock bar insert, decent ergos, lots of good frame lock access, a snappy deployment. It is lightweight and with a very nice size. On the great side, I love the blade. The blade on this is great. There's a reason utility blades are called utility blades. It's because they're useful. They have high amounts of utility. I mean, seriously, if you go to the grocery, well, maybe not the grocery store, but you go to the hardware store and you buy a utility blade like this guy, you are getting quite literally this same blade shape, something that is relatively thin behind the edge, and something that is going to be perfect for these kinds of downward cutting. This knife is perfectly suited for this kind of cut, where you're going, and I'm assuming there's a surface right here because I can't show you this vertically because that doesn't make sense. Anyways, they're really good. A Wharncliffe blade is a stellar choice for utility. You also have a nice sharp tip at the end here. You've got a beautiful little sharpening choil. The knife is beautifully thin behind the edge. This is a great grind. No matter what else is wrong here, the grind on this was on point. And, you know, overall, the blade is good. It's S35 VN. The very best part of this knife is this part right up front here with this beautiful, beautiful utility-focused cutting machine sort of blade. To me, that is what's great, 1000%, is that utility-style blade. On the bad front, there were a couple of little issues, a couple of much bigger ones. To start with, it needs a detent ball ramp. The detent on this guy is very prominent, and once you open the knife, it definitely takes a little doing to get that in there. This is something that has gotten a little bit better. I suspect that there was a burr on the side of the lock face there that made that really difficult at first, but it still could use a little bit of a ramp. That's always a nice thing when it's there. Next thing, although I mentioned the lock bar access here being good, you can see that this little area right here comes up to a pretty, I don't want to say sharp, because it's not going to cut you open, but it's definitely a very acute edge. And so as you're opening this guy, there's going to be a little bit of pain there. Not the end of the world, but it's something to consider. Next thing, as I mentioned in the disassembly process, the screws on this is super shallow. What I mean by that is that the depth of the screw hole isn't terribly large, and then they've done that little thing where they chamfer down the edges of the hole. So effectively, the actual depth at which your Torx bit is engaging is very, very shallow, despite the screw itself being quite prominent. And so as a result, it was very easy to slip up out of these guys, even using good drivers. I'm really unimpressed with these screws. I don't like this particular kind of screw a whole lot, and a lot of people tend to do it a little bit better than Kizer has done here. But it just makes it, I don't know, there have got to be better ways to do that. Next thing, the detent on this guy is definitely a little bit too strong. This is a knife, and this is just speculation here. I don't know what they were thinking at the factory, but I kind of suspect that they did the detent in the way that they did, mostly because the action on the knife isn't all that good. And we'll talk about that in a second, but it's a very slow deploy. It's not super smooth, even with full lubrication and clean out. And so in order to make the knife reliably flick open, you need to have a super strong detent to build up a lot of energy there. And as a result, there have definitely been times where I've sort of, like, I pull out of the pocket ready to deploy, and then if I'm putting any pressure on the lock bar here at all, it's like, oh, that's not coming open. And then on times when I completely let off that lock bar, it can occasionally, it's just, this is the problem of using a detent ball with huge prominence, is that becomes tricky to overcome. This was way worse earlier on. When I first got the knife, I actually talked to Kizer and I said, guys, I got to send this thing back. It's so, yeah. I had a couple of issues with it, but one of the biggest ones is there was a big burr around the detent ball holder. At least I suspect that was the case. At the time, I wasn't able to get the damn thing open. And so for the first maybe couple of dozen deployments, it was working through that, and then it broke off and the detent got a lot better. It got a lot more reasonable. It's still, though, super strong, and I'm not a big fan of that. Even as it stands, even with the little bit of work I did on it during the disassembly, yeah, not super impressed there. Next thing, the action on this guy, like I said, is pretty poor. Part of that is because, well, I don't know, I'm getting the feeling it wasn't super well made, but even more so than that, it's using a Teflon washer sandwich construction with some kind of, looks like a brass washer with a Teflon in there, and the Teflon in there is pre-shredded, which is nice of them. And the washers themselves are in really bad shape, but whatever it is, although, you know, certainly it's okay. It's not like I've had worse actions, but it's just not very good. There were great phosphor bronze washer actions out there, and this is unfair. This is a much more expensive knife here. This is a Cheburkov Strij, but nevertheless, I really am not impressed with the action on this guy, and that requires the detent and such. It's just unpleasant. So, to me at least, what's bad here is the poor action. It's, I think, caused by that internal Teflon approach and the bad washes overall. Has an overly strong detent, even though it's not quite as strong as when it still had that burr there. It's using shallow screws. The lock bar corners were a little bit sharp, being really my only real issue with the design rather than the implementation. Then it needs a detent ball ramp. On the ugly front, honestly, this isn't that well made. Look, Kizer is a company that has done some very nicely made knives. I mean, you all know this. Kizer has been a company that I have featured on my channel over and over and over again, and, in large part because even if they're not doing super high-end, we knives will usually have the edge on them in terms of, will usually, in terms of build quality, rayon, etc., but they've been very, very good in that middle range. Very often they make some pretty excellent stuff, but this feels like a major step down relative to Kizer's norm. Because there were a bunch of things in there that are not great. Like I said, the phosphor bronze washes, as you look at my disassembly video, were actually kind of crimped a little bit. It almost looked like the machine that was cutting them wasn't doing it well. It felt like that was a major problem they were having. Similarly, the Teflon washes in there were pre-shredded, which isn't great. I mean, Teflon washes at all aren't a great thing in a knife, in my estimation, because precisely they are able to fail in a way that you really can't make a phosphor bronze washer fail. But that wasn't good. In addition, when I first got the knife out of the box, I thought it was Loctited shut. And then I decided, okay, I'd try some heat on that, and that didn't do anything. And then finally, I just decided, you know what, okay, screw it. Let me put a little gronk on it. I got out my little ratcheting thing, and I really gave it a bit of a crank. This is not a good idea. In fact, it was a dumb idea. And then what I realized is that actually the pivot had just been so over-tightened that it was locked in place in a serious way. That also made the action even worse than it was. It was really bad. Once I did that, the pivot came out completely clean. There was no Loctite or anything, but at the factory, they so over-tightened this guy that it made it almost impossible to take apart initially. And that wasn't amazing. And then I mentioned there was also the burr around the detent ball hole. I mean, honestly, this knife was just less well executed by the factory than nearly every Kizer I have ever seen. The first generation Feist was differently not well done, but this is really not great. I really don't know what changed. That's the funny thing for me. Is like, okay, if this knife didn't say Kizer on the side of it, I'd just be kind of writing off whatever brand this was from. I'd just be like, okay, they're not doing great work. And I almost wonder, and I have no information about this, but I almost wonder whether they're using a different factory for this knife than has made their prior ones, because this feels like a huge step down. It feels like they're cutting a lot more corners. It just doesn't really impress me in that way. And considering that the price on this guy, which is sort of the other ugly thing, although, it's like, for more than $100, you're not allowed to do these kinds of things. There are companies like Civivi, like Ruwaiki, like Sanren, that are just doing a better choice of this, or I'm sorry, doing a better job of all of this. Even like Artisan's a budget line, the CJRB. They're just doing a markedly better job, but they're doing so in a way that's, well, better, and they're doing it cheaper. And so I feel like something is different here. Whether they've just relaxed their standards in their existing factory, whether they've moved to a different factory, whether they've just subcontracted, this isn't good. And I really desperately hope that this isn't what Kizer is going to look like in the future, because if it is, it's not something I want to keep featuring on the channel, because they're not allowed to charge prices that are mid-range for knives that are built like they're really pretty kind of cheap. So to me, at least, that's what's ugly here, is that the build quality isn't good and the price isn't adjusted down enough to really represent that. Maybe this was particularly bad. I can't guarantee that this wasn't a Friday night knife, so to speak. Maybe they were about to get off work. One guy, oh, I gotta make one more before we hit the tequila, buddies. I don't know what they're drinking over there in Guangzhou, but whatever. Maybe that's what happened here. This was the laziest one of these ever, and they just got unlucky with it getting to me, but that's not great. So to me, at least, that's definitely ugly. Final conclusion here on this guy. I like the design of this knife a lot, actually. My final conclusion is basically it's a nice design done poorly, that is. And that's kind of frustrating to me, because it is at some level a great little sequel to the Rogue. I like the Kizer Rogue, but in some ways this feels like a little bit more of a tight knife, so to speak. It's a little smaller, it's a little bit, and frankly, I like the grind a little more. The grind on this is great. That's the one thing I can't complain about with build quality. Like this part of it, absolutely freaking good to go. But it's a good size. It's got solid ergos. It's got a nice finish and excellent blade. I like the blade on this very much, but it's kind of let down in a bunch of places. My only real design gripe are these sharp corners right in here. But the too strong detent, the free spinning pivot, the poor action, like I said, build quality that is just way lower than Kizer's norm. And so this is ultimately one of those reviews that splits evenly between design and execution. If this knife were made really well, I think I would like it a lot. I'd probably be recommending it regularly. It's a beautiful little design with a great utility blade. I just wish that it had been done by a factory either within Kizer or outside of Kizer that would do a little bit of a better job with it. And I really desperately hope that this particular knife and the construction we're seeing here was a fluke rather than a brand new sheriff in town, so to speak, over there at Kizer. Because if this is the future of Kizer, I'm not sure Kizer's future's looking that good. So anyways, like I said, it's frustrating. I hope desperately that this was just like a one-off. They tried a factory, like, nope, whoops. But, you know, who knows? Anyways, there you go. I hope this has been interesting to you and that you have yourselves just an absolutely wonderful rest of your day and that this review didn't get you too fired up. Okay. I'm sorry, I ain't come up with any more puns? No? Okay. Bye now. That bit. Like fire ant. Okay. Bye now.